The city never truly slept, but at night it learned how to whisper. Traffic softened into a distant hum, windows dimmed, and lives folded inward. In one such apartment, on the third floor of a building no one remembered the name of, Elias sat at a small table by the window. A notebook lay in front of him, clean, untouched, accusing in its silence. He wasn't unhappy, at least not in a way that could be explained easily. His days were filled with tasks completed on time, conversations that stayed polite, meals eaten without thinking. People would have said he was doing fine. And maybe he was, but fine felt thin, hollow, like a word people used when they didn't want to look too closely. There was something missing, something he couldn't justify wanting. He felt it most strongly at night, when distractions ran out and there was nothing left to perform for. The hunger arrived quietly then, not for food or company, but for something older, deeper, something he had once known how to reach. As a child, stories had been his refuge. He remembered hiding under blankets with a flashlight, heart racing not from fear but from wonder. Stories had given him permission to feel too much, to be scared, hopeful, broken, brave, all without consequence. Somewhere along the way, he had learned that adults weren't supposed to need such things. Stories were labeled unproductive, unrealistic, childish. So he let them go, the way people let go of dreams they can't defend. But the hunger never left. It settled instead behind his ribs, a dull pressure that made quiet moments uncomfortable. Elias often wondered if everyone felt this and simply handled it better, or if he was uniquely weak for noticing it at all. His eyes drifted again to the notebook. He had bought it months ago on an impulse, telling himself it was for notes, ideas, anything practical. Yet it waited patiently, as if it knew its real purpose. Outside, a light flickered off in the building across the street. Another person surrendering to sleep. Elias remained awake, breathing slowly, aware of a truth he had avoided for years. He wasn't tired because of work or age or responsibility. He was tired because he had stopped listening to the part of himself that once survived on stories. The hour went out without warning, the way important moments often do. 1 second the room was washed in artificial light, the next it was swallowed by darkness. Elias sat still, listening to the sudden quiet. No fan, no refrigerator hum, no glowing screens pretending to be company. Just the sound of his own breathing, louder than he expected. He found a candle in the kitchen drawer, half melted and forgotten. When he lit it, the flame trembled before steadying, throwing soft shadows across the walls. The apartment looked different in that light, less functional, more honest. Imperfect corners showed. So did dust. So did him. He returned to the table and opened the notebook. Not because he had planned to, but because the silence felt heavy, and doing nothing suddenly seemed harder than doing something small. The first page stared back at him, empty and patient. His hand hovered, uncertain. He wasn't a writer. He told himself that immediately, the way people repeat rules they didn't make but still obey. Still, he wrote a single sentence, no ambition, no structure. Just a line about a woman who had learned to stay quiet because every time she spoke, the world seemed busy elsewhere. The words surprised him as they appeared, as if they had been waiting longer than he had. He paused, expecting embarrassment. It didn't come. Instead, something in his chest loosened slightly, like a knot being touched for the first time. He wrote another line, then another. The woman gained habits, memories, a history of being unseen. Elias noticed his shoulders had dropped, his jaw unclenched. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding himself together. Time moved strangely. The candle burned lower. The city outside stayed dark. Elias kept writing, not fast, not impressively, but honestly. For once, he wasn't trying to sound intelligent or interesting. He was just listening. When he finally stopped, his hand ached, and the page was full. He closed the notebook gently, almost respectfully, as if it were something alive. Lying down in the darkness, he felt a calm he hadn't earned through effort. His mind didn't race. It rested. As sleep pulled him under, Elias understood something simple and unsettling. The voice he'd been waiting to hear all these years hadn't been missing. He had just stopped giving it space to speak. The nights that followed didn't announce themselves as anything special. They arrived quietly, one after another, ordinary in appearance, yet each carried a different weight. Elias began to notice how his mood decided the kind of story that wanted to be written, not the other way around. Some evenings, his hands moved quickly, almost urgently. Those nights produced tense stories, tight scenes where footsteps echoed in empty corridors, where something unseen followed just close enough to be felt. He didn't analyze why these stories came so easily. He only noticed that after writing them, his own anxiety softened, as if the fear had found somewhere else to live for a while. Other nights were gentler. The writing slowed. The sentences grew softer, rounder. He wrote about quiet rooms, early mornings, people who found comfort in small rituals, tea cooling on a windowsill, a familiar voice on the phone, the simple relief of being understood. These stories felt like exhaling. They didn't excite him, but they steadied him. Then there were nights he avoided the notebook altogether. Those were the dangerous ones, because eventually he would open it anyway, and what came out then was heavier. Stories where characters faced the versions of themselves they had spent years denying, where apologies came too late, where regret didn't scream, but sat patiently, waiting to be acknowledged. Elias began to understand that genres were not categories, they were disguises. Each story wore a different mask, but underneath, the emotions were unmistakably his. Fear dressed as suspense, longing disguised as calm, guilt reshaped into psychological tension. What surprised him most was how little effort it took once he stopped trying to impress an imaginary audience. The stories weren't polished. Some were clumsy, some ended abruptly, but they felt real, and that mattered more than beauty. He no longer measured his nights by productivity or sleep alone. He measured them by honesty. On nights he wrote truthfully, even when it hurt, he woke up lighter. On nights he avoided it, the old heaviness returned. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Elias stopped asking whether the stories were good. That question belonged to someone else, someone braver, someone louder. His concern was simpler now. Was he listening when something inside him needed to speak? More often than not, the answer became yes. One night, the story refused to stay at a safe distance. Elias sensed it the moment he picked up the pen. There was no familiar tension, no comforting softness, only a quiet pressure, the kind that makes you aware something important is being avoided. He wrote about a man who had mastered the art of appearing stable. The man paid his bills, kept his voice calm, and avoided risks disguised as dreams. He called it maturity, responsibility, survival. On the page, the man's life looked respectable, complete. Yet every sentence carried a strange absence, like a room furnished carefully but never lived in. Halfway through, Elias stopped. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. The words on the page no longer felt invented. They felt exposed. He tried to adjust the character, make him different enough to remain fiction, but the resistance only grew. The pen hovered uselessly. His hands trembled. So he continued honestly. The man in the story admitted in a moment of unbearable stillness that he had chosen safety over truth again and again, not because he lacked courage, but because he feared disappointment more than regret. Writing that sentence felt like stepping onto thin ice. It cracked immediately. Tears came without drama. No sobbing, no sound. Just warmth on his cheeks and a heaviness in his throat. Elias didn't wipe them away. He let them fall onto the paper, smudging ink, ruining neatness. For once, he wasn't concerned with control. What broke him wasn't sadness alone. It was recognition. The understanding that he had been living carefully, not fully, that he had mistaken endurance for strength. The story had become a mirror, and he couldn't look away without lying. When he finally put the pen down, the room felt different. Quieter, but not empty. He felt exposed, yes, but also strangely grounded, as if something false had been removed. The pain was sharp, but clean. Elias sat there long after the writing stopped, breathing slowly, letting the truth settle without rushing to explain it away. He understood then that storytelling was not always gentle. Sometimes it demanded honesty without offering comfort in return. Yet beneath the ache there was relief, because naming what hurts does not weaken a person. It frees them from pretending it doesn't exist. For a long time, Elias kept the stories to himself, as if they were something fragile that might lose their meaning if exposed to air. They lived in the notebook and nowhere else. But the need to share crept in slowly, quietly, the way confidence does when it grows from truth rather than praise. He didn't attach his name. He didn't explain himself. One evening, with more hesitation than hope, he typed out a short piece and posted it in a small, forgotten corner of the internet where strangers gathered to read rather than perform. When he closed the app, his stomach tightened. The old instinct to retreat whispered that he had said too much. The next morning, there were a few responses. Not applause, not criticism, recognition. Someone wrote that the story felt uncomfortably familiar. Another said they had read it twice because it named something they had never known how to articulate. One message simply said, "I thought I was the only one." Elias stared at the screen longer than necessary. He felt a strange warmth, followed by a deeper humility. The story hadn't impressed anyone. It had connected. That felt heavier and far more real. He shared another piece a week later, then another. Each time, the fear softened. The replies came from different lives, different places, yet they carried the same undercurrent. Relief. As if the stories had given people permission to feel what they had been hiding even from themselves. Elias began to understand that storytelling was not a solitary act, even when written alone. It was a quiet exchange of courage. One person risking honesty so another could recognize themselves without shame. The idea of audience changed for him. It was no longer something to win over or impress. It was a group of unseen people sitting in the dark, holding similar weight, grateful that someone had spoken first. On nights he doubted the value of what he wrote, he returned to those messages. Not as validation, but as reminder. The words mattered not because they were perfect, but because they were true. Elias no longer felt like he was throwing his voice into emptiness. He was adding it to a shared fire, small but steady, where strangers could warm their hands and remember they were not alone. Years passed, not marked by dramatic changes, but by quieter shifts that only made sense in retrospect. Elias still lived in the same city, still walked the same streets, still woke up to ordinary mornings. From the outside, little had changed. Inside, almost everything had. Writing never became effortless. Some nights, the notebook stayed closed, heavy with expectation. Other nights, it opened easily, as if it had been waiting. Elias learned not to force either state. He had stopped treating storytelling like a duty or a cure. It was a practice now, like listening, like breathing. The stories continued to vary. Some soothed him, wrapping the edges of difficult days in softness. Others unsettled him, dragging uncomfortable truths into the light when he least expected it. He welcomed both. Comfort taught him rest. Discomfort taught him honesty. What surprised him most was how writing reshaped his life beyond the page. He spoke more carefully, but also more truthfully. He noticed his emotions before they hardened into habits. When something hurt, he didn't rush to bury it under distraction. He let it exist. That alone felt like progress. He no longer searched for happy endings. He had learned that adulthood rarely offers them in clean, complete forms. Instead, it offers moments of clarity, brief, imperfect, enough. His stories reflected that. They ended where understanding began, not where problems disappeared. Sometimes late at night, Elias thought about the version of himself who once believed he had outgrown stories. He felt no anger toward that man, only compassion. Survival had required silence then. Now, it required expression. The notebook was no longer an object of longing or fear. It was a companion, a place where nothing had to be optimized or justified, a place where he could be fully human without explanation. Elias understood, finally, that storytelling for adults was not about escaping reality or chasing imagination. It was about staying present with life as it is, complex, unfinished, emotional. And every time he wrote, he wasn't creating a story. He was continuing one. His own.